Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. And welcome also to those of you who are joining us from our YouTube live stream. Thank you so much for joining us for our November 3rd Thursday, first, second, and third points of view. I'm, as Evan said, Laura Arnold, the program manager here at the Writers League of Texas, and I'm beyond honored to be able to put on events such as this and chat with such amazing writers. I wanted to let everyone know, as if you haven't seen from our announcement earlier today or on our website, that unfortunately Jasminne Mendez had an unforeseen conflict and will not be able to attend. I do hope you'll take some time to check out her work. She's a brilliant writer, but onwards we go with Jennifer and Lucas and I. We're still going to have a really great conversation that I'm really, really excited for. We're going to be talking a little bit about the challenges and opportunities that result from choosing to set a story in first or second or third point of view. And our panelists are Jennifer duBois. Jennifer duBois' debut novel, A Partial History of Lost Causes, was the winner of the California Book Award for First Fiction, the Northern California Book Award for Fiction, a Whiting Authors Award, a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 Award, and was a finalist for the PEN/Hemingway Award for Debut Fiction. Her second novel, Cartwheel, was a finalist for New York Public Library's Young Lions Award and the winner of the Housatonic Book Award. duBois' third novel, The Spectators, was a recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts Creative Writing Fellowship and a Civitella Rianieri Fellowship. Her latest novel, The Last Language, was a finalist for the Writers League of Texas Book Award for Fiction and was named a Vox Best Book of 2023. A graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and the Stanford University Steigner Fellowship, duBois teaches in the MFA program at Texas State University. Thank you so much for being here, Jennifer.
Thank you for having me. I see some Texas State representative in the chat. Go Bobcats.
Lucas Schaeffer is our other author here today. Lucas Schaeffer's debut novel, The Slip, is now available from Simon & Schuster. The Slip is the winner of the 2025 Kirkus Prize for Fiction and is a USA Today national bestseller. Lucas's other work has appeared in One Story, The Baffler, Slate, and other publications. He holds an MFA from the New Writers Project at UT Austin, and Lucas lives with his family in Austin. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I will say that I had to leave my office because we had some technical issues, but in my office is a stuffed bobcat, like a taxidermy bobcat that I've had for 20 years before I even knew about Texas State. So
I was just
there
going
you
to
go.
ask you if that came with the house or if it was
No, that
like part of the
came with
writer's
me.
lair. There was just a bobcat that was present here.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, that came with me.
That's funny. Before we jump into our discussion, I did want to let our audience know one thing, which is we'll be collecting your questions and dedicating some time at the end of the program to answering them. So please do submit any and all questions you have for our panelists on tonight's topic. To do so, you navigate to your Zoom toolbar, which is usually in the bottom portion of your screen. There is going to be a Q&A option. And if you click that option, you can submit a question and I'll be collecting them and presenting them to Jennifer and Lucas at the end of the panel. Without further ado, let's talk about some points of view. So to get us started, I wanted to speak to each of you about your most recent stories, The Last Language and The Slip. Will you tell us about the point of view of your novels and how and why you decided to use that perspective? Lucas, let's start with you.
Oh, sure. Okay, so The Slip is about, just to give you a little bit of context, it's about a young 16-year-old boy who's sent to Austin in the summer of 1998. He's a very hapless young man. He's from Massachusetts. He gets into a fight at school. He's sent to Austin for the summer, and he begins working out at a boxing gym in Austin. And over the course of this summer, really starts to find himself and feel like he understands who he is. And at the end of the summer, he disappears. And the book follows a huge cast of characters over about 20 years as we find out what happened to him. And so the perspective of the book is quite wide ranging. It opens with a chapter that's a third person omniscient narrator. We meet not all of them, we meet many of the characters at the gym. Um, and then as we move through the novel, it switches a little bit. So after that big first chapter, we have a close third person. And for much of the novel, we're in close third person following different characters closely. We do slip into first person at one point. There is a chapter in first person plural, the we. There is a chapter in the second person. And then the book ends with a big omniscient narrator, again, following us with many of these same characters, but about 20 years later. So perspective is something I have a lot of thoughts about. And I should say this wasn't David Peterson says Richard Lord. Yes, the book is sort of inspired by Lord's boxing gym a little bit, where I used to work out. But this wasn't just like oh, let's try as many different perspectives as I can. I mean, one of the major themes of this book is identity and people becoming who they are, who they want to be, someone completely different. There are lots of big transformations throughout the book. And so perspective was really important because the characters are not, they're literally changing identities at times in the book. So it really mattered who was telling each story and how those stories were being told.
Thank you, Lucas. What about you, Jennifer?
First of all, I'm so like amazed and thrilled to read that. I can't believe you did not only like all of them, but then subsets like the plural, the plural first person, etc., and second person. No easy task.
Yeah.
Um, so my book, yeah, got a little bit of a complicated premise, but it's basically a story of a um, uh, language philosopher turned sort of unaccredited speech pathologist who in the 90s, or I guess it's the early 2000s, begins working with a client who is nonverbal or is non-speaking and uses this very controversial sort of Ouija board-like device to try to sort of stabilize his hands to facilitate communication because he's got some like psychomotor agitation issues. And through this, she develops these conversations with him and falls in love with him and decides that she's found this person that's incredibly brilliant. And then inevitably they're discovered and the rest of the world, believes that this device has in fact sort of been her projecting the whole thing all along. That's not a spoiler because it's kind of there from like the first page. You open it and you see that she's like imprisoned and she's telling the story. So it's first person because I mean, although I sometimes quibble with the notion of unreliability in fiction, just because I think we're all unreliable. So I think it's like a little bit of a false distinction to talk about like an unreliable narrator versus a reliable narrator. It's certainly the case that in certain books, like the question of the character's judgment, like interpretation of facts and also moral judgment, can be more or less central, like more or less salient. And this book, it's the entire plot essentially. Like, your suspense derives from whether you basically trust her judgment on what's happening and what it means. So it's pretty important that that be in a first person that could be kind of charming and self-serving in some ways and disarming in other ways and forthcoming. And then that first person, I think, is sort of further particularized by sort of two choices. One is that it uses a direct address to the absent listener, who's her um, former lover slash patient slash victim, depending on how you sort of look at things. So she tells the story to him, directing the story to this absent you, like saying, you did this, you whatever. But simultaneously, you understand that she's like already in prison and kind of is also telling the story a little bit for like an audience of her peers and like jurors or like the readers. So there's something almost a little sneaky about the you because I think it's like on a literal sense it refers to this other character Sam, but when you consider like what the context is in other ways, it might feel like it's actually like addressing you, the reader, like you, the jury, sort of, if that makes sense. So it's a very long way of saying it's just first, it's just point of view first.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I enjoyed the use of point of view in both of your novels immensely. So thank you for being here to talk about it with an audience. Um, I wanted to continue along that line for a little bit. What do you think the primary effect of your chosen point of view had on the way that your story was received by your reading audience? And how do you think a different point of view would have changed the different point of view used at different times would have changed the way that the story is perceived?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Thank you.
Um, Well, I think in my case, because it's such an outlandish sort of premise and so many points of view, and you learn kind of early on that there are going to be a lot of points of view. I think that signals to the reader something about the type of book that you're reading. So, I mean, this novel, The Slip, is 500 pages. It's literally every perspective, and I kind of wanted to clue readers in from the beginning. Hey, buckle up, this is, you're going to go on an adventure and it's going to be fun, but like we're going in some different directions. So I think part of it for me was setting expectations early on, that hey, this is a little bit different, but kind of go with it. And I think, in some earlier drafts, some of the switching in points of views happened later on, and there was sort of a feeling of uh, this feels like you don't know what you're. I was sort of thematically working with a lot of intention. Like I knew why I was switching around points of view, but I think to earlier drafts, it sort of felt like, oh, this feels a little amateurish, or like he's not quite sure how to do this. So I think it's really important to just set expectations, early on.
Yeah, that makes sense. How about you, Jennifer?
Well, I think this book kind of had to be in first person because it sort of it borrows a lot of themes like from Nabokov, like from Lolita, but also from Pale Fire. It's very much a story that's not just being experienced, but being narrated. This is a distinction that I make sometimes when I'm talking to my MFA students, because sometimes, I mean, I think really close third, you might agree, Lucas, can like really feel like first. Like if you're really, really close psychic distance, it can feel almost identical. Like I kind of think really good close third kind of feels almost identical. So when I think about what's that distinction then between really close third and first, to me, what always comes up is that quality of like, but then the character told it as opposed to just experienced it. It's like now I crafted it into a narrative. And I feel like that aspect where you're not just getting what the character thinks and perceives, but like the way they would arrange that all in language, to me that felt very important for this story because it's not just about what she experiences and perceives and thinks. It's like also about how she like arranges it into story. That's like very critical to the text. So to the text, yes, I just refer to my own book as a text. But I do think that it's like baked in, like it couldn't have been a different point of view. I think one thing about first that I also talk with my students about a lot is that it puts such an emphasis on voice that the good news can be if a reader finds your voice to be like very seductive and very charming, then they might kind of go with it, even into places that feel like a little more uncomfortable than they might usually go. Flip side of that is that if you write a book where people find your voice annoying, then regardless of the other virtues, they might be off put by it. So I think like that's just one, it's like you said in terms of challenges and opportunities with each choice, it's not like that's a good or a bad thing. It's just simply a feature of first person is that you're gonna have a voicey voice and people
Yeah.
will react to it.
And I love that distinction of telling the story versus experiencing the story as the person. I think that's really interesting. Beyond your most recent books, what are your experiences? Will you speak a little bit to your experiences writing from different points of view in your other projects?
So this book took about 12 years to write, and I started writing seriously about 12 years ago. So
So you said what other projects?
almost every project has sort of been incorporated into this. But I will
Yeah.
say that um, this may be interesting to those of you who are experimenting with some different types of point of view. The I started this project thinking I was writing a short story collection, kind of the Visit from the Goon Squad type ilk. So in that book, everything's related by music. And my thought was, oh, I'm going to do that for boxing. And it turned out that I couldn't do that because short stories are short, and I do not write short stories. So this took a while to learn. However, one of the first short stories I wrote in this world was actually an oral history. So it was like a magazine oral history about some of the characters from the gym and an incident at the gym. And it essentially looked like a play or a screenplay or something. Um, and I didn't end up including that in the book itself, even though many of the characters in the book appear there. But I found it a really great way to get to know their voices. And I do think that's sort of useful more broadly. I have students I work with on manuscripts who I will sometimes say, write this as a scene, just in dialogue, and let that help you guide kind of how what perspective is speaking to you. I mean, if you're writing this dialogue and there's a voice and you're like, man, I can do this voice, you have your answer. If there's more sort of equality between the voices and how comfortable you feel, that is likely a reason to either have alternating perspectives or a third person voice. I mean, this is not science, but I found it useful in the past.
Jennifer?
Yeah, let's see. One of my books was in all third. And then I've had two that had that one had four third person points of view, and then two of the other books each had one in first and one in third. And now the
Mhm.
one I'm working on now has more points of view, like potentially seven or something, and they're all in third. But I don't know. Like hearing Lucas talk, I was like, wait a minute, like maybe they don't all need to be in third. Like maybe I should like experiment with I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe I've got enough going on and I should just sort of like let it be what it's what it's being. But yeah, so first and third, and I'll sort of complicate those choices with like different relationships to time. Like I've done like third person past tense and third person present tense and first person with like a retrospective point of telling. But the one thing I don't go near is second person, personally.
Thank you both for talking a little bit about your experiences writing. I liked just setting the stage, and it was really cool to hear about you talk about both your most current writing project and the ways that you've played around with stuff in the past. I do want to, for a panel of writers, go back to the beginning. You've already been dipping your toe into theory, which has been really great, and I've been really enjoying. But when you are first drafting a story or a short story, at what stage do you settle on your point of view? And then have you ever regretted that initial choice or changed your point of view later in the revision process?
I almost always will start in third now, um, because I that to me is the most expansive and the most gives me the most flexibility. And as was the case with this book project, there were a couple of voices that were just so overpowering that I thought, okay, they need their time in the spotlight. Um, but part of what I like about third person, and particularly an omniscient third person, a narrator who can see everything, is I think it lets you quite easily play with time in ways that uh, can be more challenging if you're dealing with uh, the I, who's presumably only telling this story, at a particular time, right? Um, and so to me, having that freedom is really useful as a starting point.
Thank you. That makes sense.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I don't know that this is very helpful, but to tell you the truth, I think that it's always been kind of baked in, like which choice it was going to be. I think the only way I can like, that's not very useful to hear, like that somebody else sort of had some instinctive sense, because then like how do you apply that to your own work? I do think this is a little crafty, but I've heard the distinction described. Um, like I think that first person maybe slightly kind of emphasizes interiority over event. And again, they both can have both. Like both close third and first can absolutely contain both like event and interiority. But sometimes I think when I've had characters where it feels like their state of mind is like is like really the thing, you know? Like in this book, like what this woman really thinks is going on, like that's really the thing. And like in my first book, one of the point of view characters who's first person has received like a terminal diagnosis of this like degenerative brain disorder. And so like it sort of just made sense to me intuitively that like she's in first person. Whereas the other character is this chess champion turned dissident in Soviet and post-Soviet Russia, and partly because of the expansive time range that spans, but also partly just because his story was sort of like event forward. Third person sort of made sense to me for that. So, uh, but I do think also it's like I don't know, like sometimes sometimes you start with an event or you start with an image or you start even with an ending if you're writing a story, I think. And sometimes you do just start with a voice. Like sometimes it is sort of here, here's somebody in your ear. And so I don't think there's any wrong way to start, but I think certainly if you ever do sort of like hear that like somebody's language or just like a certain strange way of putting things like in your ear, like that can be a good indicator that maybe that's a first person voice to follow.
Um, do you ever experience challenges fitting your stories into the point of view you ultimately chose, such as being unable to translate certain emotions or information? And then how do you deal with those?
Well, I clearly do, and I do that by just switching perspective.
It's so great. I love it.
Which would not be, I think, appropriate for um every story. Um but I do think, I mean, I think when I'm working with writers who really feel confident in the story they're telling but feel stuck, I do think that perspective and actually tense are the two places to start. Now, that's only if sometimes you're writing a story and you realize, this story is not what I want to tell, or these characters are not people I want to be with. And that's a different scenario. But, I think oftentimes I'll be working and I'll know I'm on the right track. Like, I like these people, I like where they're going. Um, and so for me, perspective and tense are the first sort of, okay, let's tweak these and see. Um, it when you know it, when it's working. Um, and so I think that's always a nice place to start.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure, like in thinking about the weak spots in my book, like in my books, I feel like with a couple of them, there's like a certain kind of contrivance in some of the plotting, but I'm really not sure how much I can blame that on the point of view. Like I was trying to think about that. I was like, well, I think especially my first and third, there's just like, I mean, whatever. It's like your mileage may vary. It's like I have a very high tolerance for like credulity. If someone tells me something in fiction, I'm just like, sure, that's probably happened once. Um, uh,
Mm.
but to the extent to which like the plots maybe in those books have like moments of the outlandish or the outlandish adjacent, I don't know that I could really blame it on the point of view choice per se as much as my like decision over and over again with the last language being the one exception to write books that have multiple points of view and take place across like preposterous amounts of time and then needing to make those stories connect or climax in some way that can sometimes I mean, I hope they work, but
Yeah,
there might be a
absolutely.
little bit of like flop sweat involved in like some of the some of the swerves. So yeah, but I don't think I could really blame that on first or third per se, just in like my weird decisions to always be like, oh, I know, I'll just write like something in the 60s that's like, first person retrospective and then like a first person point of view in the 1990s that's in present tense. Sure, just do that for 7 years. Why not?
Mhm.
That's can't blame on the actual the POV, I don't think.
That makes sense. Um, on a technical level, and I'm intrigued for both of you, but I'm especially in the little short I mean they're not short stories because it's part of a longer novel, but like your switches in perspective, Lucas, have you found that choosing a point of view affects the pacing of your stories? And if yes, how so?
Yes. I mean, I think everything affects the pacing, like every element. I find I'm not sure I can take perspective out in that way, but I will say when you're writing a long novel, which this is, I do think having that variation for me did kind of let me give the book like a few jolts. where you're suddenly, oh, this is something new. You know, if you do that too frequently, readers get annoyed and feel discombobulated. But I think you have a few chances to do that, and it's sort of a even the books I love the most at times, the mind drifts, right? So I think that was a way for me um, to bring people back.
That makes sense. What about you, Jennifer? And the longer projects you've had in third person versus like first person, do you find that the choosing that perspective affects the pacing in any way?
Well, I think it's kind of gone the other way because we're just thinking about like with my first and my third books, those are the two that have first person and third. In both cases, like no, I'm wrong. Am I? No, yeah, the in both cases, no, no, I'm lying to you. I was gonna come up with a theory of my own work that now I realize I don't have it's actually incorrect. Um, so does it affect the pacing? I mean, I'm sure it must because it does feel like there are different things that you slightly different things you dramatize versus summarize if you're in third versus first. Um, but I think yeah, I think that I'm struggling to come up with like a coherent comment about that. I can say
Yeah,
though that
they're
in
so deeply intertwined that makes sense.
yeah, and also I was like trying to come up with like I was like trying to look at my two books and like come up with like some through line. And then I was like, no, they actually do the opposite thing with so but I think like Lucas's point about getting the jolt, like that's something I experience a lot in the writing of it. I don't know if you you're talking about that for the readers, but I personally, especially, and maybe you found this too, working on something for a long time, like I find that a lot that I'm a little bit, ADD and I'll find, even when I was at a time in my life when I had more time to write, like, I could get kind of bored and burned out with one point of view, but then I could sort of like restart my brain by writing in somebody else's point of view for a bit. And it was almost like a trick to get myself like two writing sessions out of a day where I would normally just have one because so
But
yeah,
I completely agree. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Um, let's
that's
talk
great. Yeah.
character. We've already talked character a little bit, but point of view and character writing are so deeply intertwined. And like the point you said earlier, Jennifer, like what point of view you have sometimes determines whether you're seeing a story or having a character or like feeling like you're living it. Um, so with that in mind, in your writing, how does the point of view affect the way your character's narrative voice presents in the work?
Um, well, uh, I don't know. I mean, I guess, naturally, I mean, assuming you're in that, like, assuming you're in a character's perspective, right? Like, if you're in third or you're in first, right? We're getting access to that character's brain language. So I think in a way, the bigger distinction for me is between like the characterization of a point of view character versus like a non-point of view
Hmm.
character, because I think when I'm thinking about point of view with a character where we have access to their inner thoughts, it's like there are subtle differences in terms of like language, kind of like when I talk to my students about this, I don't know, I always kind of suggest that maybe in third person it's a little bit easier to get away with a little bit more figurative language because there's a little bit of a less of a sense that the narrator like looked at it, saw it in that simile, and then presented that moment like that simile right then, if that makes sense. Whereas like in first, um, but I think the bigger gap really is between people who where we get to look inside their brains versus the people who we don't. And like that, of course, just comes down to dramatization and then trying to give yourself ways to sort of see around your character's point of view and like kind of get some conflicting or competing information or interpretation on who is this other person. Since your point of view character, be it first or third or second, is going to have like a monopoly on interpretation. So then the question becomes like dramatization and dialogue and letting that other person like talk and letting your point of view character maybe misinterpret them or get things wrong or make their own assessments, but then we the readers get to have like our own data coming in so that we get to make our own um, opinions. So to me, that feels like the bigger distinction, I guess.
Yeah. What about you, Lucas? Any way that switching between first and third and second affects your character's narrative voice and how it appears in the work?
Yeah, I mean, well, one thing I'll say is so the slip is a mystery, right?
Hmm.
We want to find out what happened to this young boy. And so uh, that was very important in thinking about what voice I'm going to give particular characters, because of course in the mystery, different people know different things. And so and that frankly was also a reason why a big third person voice was helpful to me, because I wanted the reader to know things that not all of the characters always know. Um, I realize that's more of a plot answer than a character answer, but um, to me personally, if I'm going to write in first person, that character is going to have an idiosyncratic voice. In other words, I'm not that interested in writing a first person with a fairly standard voice, because I'm just like, I'll just do this in third and be able to explore more widely. So I think for me, like in this book, when the two instances we go into first person, once in true first person and once in first person plural, these are big characters. One is sort of like a slightly deranged clown. The other is a chapter that's narrated by the women of a Jewish women's book club. I mean, there's just like voice. Um,
Sounds so
and
good.
so, thank you. And so like that informed a lot about the characters for me. In that I have other characters who speak in, you know, the clown especially has a very idiosyncratic way of talking that literally no one else, I think, probably talks exactly like him. And so that, of course, let me really understand him. Like, who is that? Why does he talk this way? Like, interesting. Um, but you know, if you're not going to do that, for me, I pull back from first person.
For those trying to determine the best point of view for their stories, what advice would you all have?
I would say read, because I think
I
the
love that. That's awesome.
I mean, you know, when I think about the writers who I really love, I love writers who can kind of encapsulate a life or an event, like a big event or a big life, very succinctly, right? Sadie Smith, Edward P. Jones, Jennifer Egan, like these are the writers who I really respond to. And so I'm writing in not similar voices to them, but certainly in terms of, you know, those are writers who do big perspectives. They're good at omniscient third person. Um, and so that speaks to me. You know, I think if you're finding yourself reading intimate first person narratives, that's most likely what you should be writing. I mean, not always, but you know, I think you write what you read.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think always reading is like the first best, that's like the first top, like the top 10 list of advice should always just be like 1 through 10 is read, and then the next thing, number 11. Um, but yeah, not to be repetitive, but I don't know. I mean, I kind of think if you have a story in your mind such that you have like some sort of event or some sort of turn that you're interested in. I think if that's not kind of coming to you in first, then it probably doesn't need to be in first. I think you kind of know when a story needs to be in first because again, I really do think, although I can't say that all of my first person narratives have been like quite as idiosyncratic as like the clown. They have all had something, they have all had like a really good reason to be telling the story as opposed to just like they're the conduit through which we experience the story, like either because they're dying of a degenerative brain illness, or they're possibly lying about the nature of their romantic, love, which could actually be the horrific sexual exploitation of a disabled person, or because they're, like all of their friends have died in the AIDS crisis and they're, sort of self-mythologizing in this like heavy, like retrospective way. The telling is like so deeply part of their narration that it could not be otherwise to me, but the other ones feel like natural thirds. So I don't know. I think that that's not a bad way of thinking about it. If it feels like it's not just the experience, it's not just the emotional and active plot for the character, but it's then also how they spun the story themselves. Like if that feels like that's a key component, then I think that's first. I just want you all to know that my cat is like fully biting my feet, and I've like texted my husband twice, like these quiet pleas to like get the cat. So if you saw me on my phone, that's what I was doing, but I'm just stoically enduring it now for you all. So
Thank you so
That's
much for stoically enduring that. That sounds awful.
I'm
that
suffering.
that does sound terrible. Just riffing off what Jennifer just said a little bit. I mean, a comment I'm very often giving to on manuscripts um, pertains to dialogue, and something I often say is that the dialogue is too realistic, by which I mean you're including when you're writing dialogue, you're curating a conversation to essentially have the greatest hits of the conversation because no one wants to read the formalities. And I think there's something similar when evaluating first person, where it has to be something more than just I'm writing in first person. Like there kind of needs to be a reason um, to do it. And it doesn't have to be a complicated reason, but I think there needs to be a reason. And I
Yeah.
think I think part of why it's hard to answer. I mean, these are wonderful um, questions. I think I won't speak for Jennifer, but I can tell you one reason why I sort of pause to really think about these is when writing is this weird combination of there are these sort of rules and guidelines that give you some direction. But I mean, it really is not science. It really is art, right? This is we're engaged in art projects. Um, and so I do think so much of it with perspective is just feeling it out and playing with it. And, you just know
Yeah, you have fun.
you have fun, right? That
Yeah.
thing, that old thing.
Um, what do you both feel about stories that shift perspective between first, second, and third, like yours does, Lucas, or kind of
I feel like
plays with that the second person you while being a first person story like yours, Jennifer? What are some ways do you think that like how does one pull that off in ways that are interesting and successful?
I mean, not to like beat a dead horse here, but I do think intention is the key. That if there is a reason to be moving in that way, then we just go with it.
Yeah.
Um, and if there's not, then people say, well, this feels just sort of random, right?
Hmm.
Um, but I think people should do it more. I think it's fun. I find it fun as a read. I certainly find it fun as a writer, but I also find it fun as a reader.
Yeah, I do too. I don't know that I can add to it. I mean, I think if it's done well, then I'm not usually quibbling about, I mean, I think about like Jennifer Egan too, and I think about like Candy House, which I'm sure I think was also had all three, because I think the
Mhm.
second person was in that sort of like, well, I don't even know how to describe it, that thing where like the CIA, it's not even, it's like the futuristic CIA, like how to, anyway. Um, and it's like I don't know that I was asking myself like, well, why is this one? It's because but it's also because she's a genius, so like good luck, just pull it off well and nobody will complain. But if you want something a little more grounded, I think like thinking carefully about the why. And I must say just about language, my book, it's not second person, because second person, right, is when you have like a classic example would be like How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia by Mohsin Hamid. I think Bright Lights, Big City by Jay McInerney is in second person. There's a bunch of great stories like How to Become a Writer by Roy Moore. But that's where like the consciousness is the you, whereas in mine it's first person, but it's like talking to like you, my absent beloved, which comes like from, like love poetry and whatnot. But yeah, in general, I think I have the same favorites as you, Lucas, like Zadie Smith, Jennifer Egan, like, I think one thing about both of those writers is that you can tell they're completely obsessed with voice. And even though Zadie Smith does a lot of third, it's like the voice that comes out in her third person. Like she's so aware of dialect and idiolect, like those particular word choices that a character would make, like malapropisms and idioms and just like in-group jargon and she just uses all of these things to make her characters sound so different in their own heads. And it's like I think her book NW is like a master class in how to try to like hear someone's voice in their own mind and make it so different from the other person's voice. But again, just be a genius and it'll work itself out.
Well, that does raise a good point though, which is that I mean, third person is also a there is a voice, right? I mean, it's not a neutral voice. So because I love those third person writers who have a real storyteller's voice
Yeah.
or who really inhabit, a character like Jennifer was saying earlier, so it almost feels like first person. So, you can certainly write with a big voice in third person, which I think is forgotten sometimes.
Well, I think with third, you have the capacity to scale up and down with that striking distance, right? Or you can like do something, and I don't know, I haven't read your book yet, Lucas, but certainly where you can do like the omniscient like declaration about, uh, you
Yeah.
know, whatever it may be, war and peace or like bachelors and what have you, your big statements and also
Yeah.
those sort of almost like Chekhovian stories where you have like a fair bit of like psychic distance from the character and like in Gushev, you can like watch the character then like die and get eaten by a shark because you're not wedded to his brain. But then in a lot of contemporary fiction, you see stuff that's much, much closer. And it sounds like yours does both. Like that's the flexibility of third, is so you can scale up and down.
Yeah, I do love a declarative statement,
Oh yeah.
like a big sweeping
I like a first person
comment.
writer who will make a
Yeah.
declarative statement that
Oh,
sweeping.
I like that. Yeah, I like that
You're just
too.
like, who are you? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
So we've talked a lot about first person and we've talked a lot about third person. Um, why do y'all think that second person gets such a bad rep, and isn't used as often?
So I do have a chapter in second person, and I
Hmm.
do, Visit from the Goon Squad has an amazing story in second person. But I do think there's a sort of amateurishness that you can feel with second person if it's not done really well. And I'm not sure, Jennifer, maybe you have some idea why this is, but there's it can just easily lapse into um I- sort of I used to be a middle school teacher, so I can say that's sort of middle school writing, um, where it just sounds, I don't know, it sounds a little not cheap, but it just doesn't, it's just hard to pull off. I don't, maybe you have something more insightful to say.
I mean, I'll be honest, I am such a jerk about second person that I feel like you guys are nice at the Writers League of Texas, and I feel like I shouldn't besmirch like a whole point of view choice, but my students like know that and you have to acknowledge a lot of this stuff is subjective too, so like who cares, but yeah, I think I have given it some thought, and I think that in a lot of fiction, and like your mileage may vary, again, there's some really great examples of it done really, really well, like just we mentioned, several already. I think that it's a big choice. It's a loud choice. And because it's such a loud
Yeah,
choice, I think it needs to be grounded really well in like some good, solid psychological reason. And I think that a lot of the reasons that are the most sort of intuitive ones have kind of been done already. Like I think the how-to model is great, and there are some really great stories, and Mohsen Hamid's novel too. But, after you have a Laurie Moore story and a Juno Diaz story and the Mohsen Hamid novel, like how many more how-tos can we do, so I think there's something about that where it's like to come up with something new to do with it, you'd have to kind of transcend that. And I think that like Jennifer Egan does that when she's got her, I don't even know how to describe what's going on in Candy House. I won't even try, but it's something a little more complicated than that when you're being like incepted by your like future CIA. Like, I mean, I don't even know. But I think that's part of it. And I think also like this is just like please like take it or leave it and probably leave it. But I've noticed sometimes with my student fiction, particularly with like undergraduates, and honestly, particularly with undergraduate women, sometimes I've noticed that I think the writer is writing a story that seems to be sort of autobiographical, and I think maybe is feeling a little bit like uncomfortable about whether that's worth telling and then is trying to sort of put it in second person so as to universalize it and make it bigger. And like, I think sometimes that's because the story itself is maybe a little slight and doesn't quite warrant being a story. But I think sometimes it's because the writer is just really underconfident that like often her own experience like warrants being narrated. And so it has to be like inverted in this way. That's just something I've observed sometimes with my students. And so that's not to try to generalize about it across the board, but it's definitely something that I've seen over the years, like many, many times for sure.
But it also, I mean, that also it points to sort of the irony of second person, which is that for I think for second person to work, the you has to be a very specific person. It's actually not the universal you. And
Yeah.
I think oftentimes people use the universal you, and it's like then it makes no sense because like you cannot be everyone. You is someone.
Right.
Um, right.
Yeah, and then I think there's also just that comes back to it just being a loud choice where readers are just going to have different reactions to any loud choice, you know, and I make a lot of other loud choices in my fiction, so far be it for me. But I do think I know with my own students when we talk about this, it's like there's that sense of being poked when you're reading second person. And I think some people when they hear you will think like, no, I didn't, no, I wasn't, no, I wasn't. And like that will actually kind of be like a barrier. But of
Yeah.
course, I don't know. Yeah. It's loud. It's a loud choice.
Yeah, I find it really th fascinating. Thank you both for your thoughts on it. Um, I have one last question to that's more theoretical, a little woo-woo before we dive into audience questions, which is we experience the world so solely through our own point of view, just like by the act of being human. But writing acts so much as a way to experience other people's point of view. What do you think are the strengths of using any of the three, first, second, or third, as a way to like give somebody else a window into another world?
Well, I think as long as you're capturing interiority convincingly, whichever point of view you're using, is as long as you're making the reader feel like they're coming into contact with an other, then, I mean, I'm a little woo-woo about fiction and morality, but I'm also like a weird militant about craft because I actually have this grand unified theory that they're like all connected and that
Hmm.
like the key to writing like away from stereotype or whatever, or like the key to writing something that's going to like enhance somebody's like sense of empathy is to just write better. Do you know what I mean? That those like goals are not that like writing better and writing like more ethically are not like at odds, but they're actually like the same thing. Like, you can't um, so yeah, I think as long as you're making like a really good faith effort to encounter another person's humanity, and I think that like for the writer, our job is not just to like sit around educating our like ignorant readers about like how to have empathy for different people. It's like our job is to be curious about different people ourselves and try to like inculcate that empathy. And I think that, one of the
Absolutely.
most interesting things you can do in fiction is take somebody or take some position or something you genuinely don't understand about another person and try to like figure it out. Like not figure it out like, oh, now I endorse this, but figure it out like, oh, I have a sense of like the language, the story they might tell themselves. So
Hmm.
I think both things are really important, but I think we should be writing and reading from a sense of curiosity and humility. Um, and I think that that does create like the better work is when you're able to write from that place.
Absolutely. I love that curiosity and humility. How about you,
Can I
Lucas?
just take that? Can I take that answer? I think that's a good answer. I think that does it.
You're
I
gonna
think that's
co-opt
the
it.
perfect answer to that. Yeah. Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
completely agree.
Thank you both so much. That was brilliant. I loved your answers. I know that it's kind of amorphous because it's so integral to writing that it's intertwined with so many other things. So thank you for taking the time to think about the questions and give a perspective on all three of the points of view and your own experience with them. I'm going to dive now into audience questions. Um, and I'll be just letting you know, and you can take it from there. And then after that, we'll probably wrap up maybe a little bit early. So, both of you, from an anonymous attendee, they ask, do you think a novel can carry both third and first person well? I am working on a novel that is about a character looking back at her past, and I keep wanting to put the present in first and the past in third. can this be jarring to a reader?
It
Jar.
could be. What, I mean, um, I think my question would be what is gained from doing that? And I could see lots of things being gained from doing that. The character looking back at her past is in third, and the present is in first. I
Yes.
almost wonder, I mean, this is just a shot in the dark. I haven't read any of this. You know your own work better than I do. But in a way, I almost wonder if a character looking back retrospectively is a more interesting first person choice. Um, because they have all of this knowledge of things that have come before. Whereas in the present tense, there's a real advantage to being in the third person because everyone doesn't know everything else.
Yeah, I mean, without reading it, it would be impossible to comment. I think to the broad question, can it work? Of course it can work, and of course could it be jarring? Yes. I mean, I've written two books that had first and third, and in one of them, the sort of longer story arc that started earlier was in third, and in the other one, the first person was the one. So I've done it like both ways, if that makes sense. But I agree that if you're talking about retrospection at all, you're talking about like that exact thing that I was talking about, where like it's not just the story then, it's the story now, and it's the way that the narrator makes sense of both of those things and has that like one story that like sort of overlays over the second. So to me, that does seem like retrospection feels like one of those qualities, like that feels like it could kind of almost automatically trip a first person. But then again, I think it must be so obnoxious to listen to people who haven't like read a sentence of your work, be like, this is what you should do. But I agree, retrospection in general feels to me like a first date type of thing. So
Well, and also, I mean, and I will tell you right off the bat, I cannot think of a book that specifically does what you are saying. I'm sure it exists. I just can't think of it off the top of my head. But I mean, look around and find some. And if it's jarring to you, then it's jarring. But it's probably not. If it got published, it probably works for some people.
We have another question from David. When writing in first person, how do you describe events which the narrator is unaware about without jumping POVs or head hopping?
you
You
can
don't. That's the constraint. That's the
yeah,
constraint
that's
of
great.
the.
Yeah.
That's the constraint of the form, which can be great. Constraints are wonderful, but yeah.
We have another question from Tracy. Tracy asks, how do you determine when in time your narrator is telling the story, and how do you show it? Example, recounting immediately after, during the story, in retrospect, or beyond the realm of time, etc.
Yeah, so I have thoughts on this. Like I think that the way I like to sort of think about this is like that I guess, I feel like every MFA program has different like vocabulary. We talk about like point of telling, just the temporal relationship, right, between event and narration. So in present tense, the idea is that it's coincident with event, the telling is coincident with event. And then in most things you read, it's past tense, but you don't have any sense that there's like a significant amount of time that has elapsed between the conclusion of event and the telling. And then sometimes you read something where it's very, very important that there's been this significant elapsed time. So for me, I think like present tense is its own kind of like interesting, like novel choice. But I think in terms of what kind of past tense you're going to use, I always think that it just depends on like if the meaning of the story has been changed by the time that's passed, do you know what I mean? Then that's a really good like reason to do retrospection. And in that case, you would have that sense of that time that's passed sort of probably filtering in a lot of ways, like probably some explicit ways, like some mention of that, but also it would be sort of just imbued in the perspective that would be, that would have had this like big gap of time to sort of meditate on events. I think that story We Didn't by Stuart Dybek is really great to read for point of telling. It's like you can just read it, and it's a story where you can see that this event happened and meant something very particular to this kid as a young teen, but that you can tell now he's recounting it from the point of view of like a man in middle age clearly, and just the whole valence, like the story that's about like to the teen, it's like about like sex essentially, and like like that kind of loss of innocence, and then clearly you can feel that like to the older man it's about death and that kind of loss of innocence. And We Didn't by Stuart Dybek. Put in the chat.
Thanks, Jennifer.
I, yeah, I mean, I think with this question, Alex G has this great line that the easiest way to kill a story is through an unmade decision. And I think when I'm reading, um, students' fiction, I can always tell when they haven't quite determined when this is being told. So I think the most important thing is just being firm about that. I mean, put the year in your mind, put it on the wall, whatever. Obviously, if it's being told sort of as it's happening, that's a different thing. Um, and use, I think the other thing is, you know, this obviously won't work for every writer, but I think oftentimes we don't, when we're writing realist fiction, we don't kind of use retrospection to think about history as much as we could. So, like, if someone's telling a story, and it's currently 1988, but they're telling it in, you know, or the story is about 1998, but they're telling it about, 10 years later in 2008. There were things happening in the world at those times that are affecting that person and that may affect the narrative. In other words, not being afraid to really um, be true to those time periods.
Thank you. And I love that just know your answer. I think that that's right on.
Yeah, well, you can always tell when a writer has not made a decision like that,
Mhm.
and it just doesn't. When then the story doesn't work.
All right, one more question from David. If you have a lot of different POVs, does this complicate your search of comp titles when sending out QLs? I'm having some difficulty in general locating comp titles, and any advice would be great. I love this, a business question.
I mean, so right now. I'm my new project I'm working on. Like I said, I don't even know exactly how many POV. I haven't totally decided yet. I think it's like eight, but like I have like two like vestigial ones that'll probably get cut. And I mean, yeah, if I were gonna try to pitch that today, which I am not, like I would probably make those same comps that you or like mention Sadie Smith and Jennifer Egan, which I know can like sound then sort of deranged, like you're being very self-aggrandizing, but like what can you do? But I don't think I have a great answer to that specific question of like how POV choice. I'm not even really sure if that's like how comps work that much. Isn't it more like the vibe or like the reader of this would want like right like if you liked X, Y, and Z, I don't know. Lucas talk, I don't know.
Well, let me preface this by saying this is obviously not my area of expertise, but um, one, I think what Jennifer just said is probably true, that the vibes and the genre and the that stuff is much more important. The other thing I would also just say is I if you're at this point, if you're at that point in the process, by all means, this is a question worth exploring. But for those of you who are not at that point in the process, I would just put this completely out of your mind because I'm not sure it really matters. I think what matters is that you know what authors and what books your book is in conversation with, and whether those are adequate comps or not, I have no idea. But I think it seems like it's possible to get derailed from what your intentions are by thinking too much about this. And I don't want to say it doesn't matter because it obviously has has some impact, but um, I don't think you need to find titles that are doing exactly what you're doing with perspective. I just my guess is it doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's great advice. Oh dear, that's great advice. Thank you both. I think that's a great note to end on. Just write what you have in front of you first. I wanted to thank both Jennifer and Lucas for joining us tonight, and I hope that all of you here will support these wonderful writers by buying their books. So please check them out at the link that was sent out in the chat box earlier tonight. thank you so much to those of you who joined us here on Zoom, and also thank you to those of us who joined via YouTube live stream. Happy writing, everyone, and I hope you have, if it's in your future, a good holiday.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you for being here.